Welcome back, folks, to the WP-Tonic show. This week in WordPress and SaaS, we've got a great interview here with Mark Elliott. He's a cybersecurity expert, worked for the CIA and other government entities. It's going to be a fascinating chat. So, Mark, can you quickly introduce yourself to the WP-Tonic? Give us a 20, 30-second intro about yourself and your company.
Absolutely. Jonathan, thank you so much for inviting me here. So I currently run Comar Cyber, and we are a company that does cybersecurity training and consulting. Career-wise, I started out in the State Department, in the Foreign Service years ago, back in the 90s, pretty much pre-internet as we know the internet commercially today. And then after that, in the late 90s, as the internet was really taking off, I left to start an internet company that focused on cyber privacy and cybersecurity. The idea was to actually have an ISP that would let people surf anonymously and for free and send encrypted emails. This was decades ago, of course, and investors didn't really understand the value of internet privacy back then. So it was rough sledding. Then moving along, the internet, there was the big internet bubble, the internet crashed. And then after that, 9/11 happened. So after 9/11, I thought I ought to see if I can actually apply some of my skills to these pressing international problems and cybersecurity in the realm of international security. So I applied to the CIA and they accepted me. I was a case officer for a number of years there. Conventionally out in the mainstream media, the common media, they would call us spies, but we actually run spies. We were the people who recruit spies. But that's fine. If anybody wants to call me that, that's fine. I won't stand on principle on that. But in any event, so that's what I did for a number of years. So I went through all the standard case officer training, learned how to do all the spy stuff, and then worked for a number of years. But my specialty was cyber. So did a range of things in the cyber realm, but as it related to the human side of it, again, looking for people with access to cyber information, that type of thing.
Oh, right, that's great. So we'll delve more into your past, in the interview. So Andrew, would you like to quickly introduce yourself to the tribe?
Sure, I'm Andrew Palmer from Bertha.ai, and it's an AI copywriting WordPress assistant built into WordPress so you can write where you work.
That's great. And before we go into the main meat and potatoes of this great interview, we've got a small break. And for our major sponsors, we'll be back in a few moments, folks. We're coming back. I just want to point out that some of our sponsors have got some great special offers for you, the tribe. To get access to these offers and some great recommendations around plugins, services, and anything else that you might find useful, all you have to do is go over to WP-Tonic/recommendations, and all the goodies are there. So, Mark, obviously, it's interesting times we're living in, and cybersecurity, to say that it's in the news almost every day would be a slight understatement. What do you see as some of the biggest threats and things on the radar that keep you up at night yourself? I know you're a sound sleeper, Mark, but what are some of the things that you think are really on your radar at the present moment when it comes to cybersecurity?
Jonathan, that's a great question. And it's a lot of the same things that we've been facing for a number of years now. Ransomware, phishing, boss impersonation, those types of things. The thread that they all have in common, though, is that almost all of these are human factors threats. These are not esoteric zero-day hacks, that type of thing, that highly trained hackers are using to breach companies or individual systems. These are things that can be defended against, and certainly in terms of companies should be defended against as a matter of policy. But again, it comes down to the human factors. It's things like social engineering, people tricking or attackers tricking employees into giving away passwords or access that they shouldn't have, those types of things. Phishing scams. And again, the boss impersonation types of things like I talked about. If you don't have policies in place in your company to verify when certain types of directives are given, that's a human problem. It's not even a cyber problem, but of course it leads to a cyber problem because it opens the door to it. You can have the most secure castle in the world, but if you leave the front gate open, it's not going to be secure for very long. In terms of new threats for individuals, I would say the one new thing, in addition to all the standard old things, ransomware and social engineering, QR code hijacking. I would say that's a fairly new thing, and that comes out of the time during the pandemic. Of course, we're still largely in the pandemic, but before people were going, or I should say now that people are going back out to restaurants and places, it's very popular to not give people physical menus, for example.
Yeah.
You just give them the QR code, right? So not to give any ideas to potentially bad actors, but it would be a pretty straightforward thing to print out your own QR code, paste it over top of the tabletop or the menu, what have you, and then direct people maliciously to your own website and steal their money, make it look like they're ordering something, and that type of thing. So there are all kinds of things that you can do with QR codes in a malicious way. So again, I would say that's a big threat for individuals, and I'd caution everybody just to be careful. Right when they put their camera on the QR code, just make sure you know where it's taking you to before you click.
That's great. Over to you, Andrew.
That's a great tip. I mean, we've got a question here that's you've obviously had a little bit of a pre-view of these, but WordPress, and I'm going to just slightly reword this, WordPress and open source software are seemingly not as secure as they could be if people don't take the measures that are recommended by developers and or hosts. What do you think? What are your general views on that WordPress is not secure? And I'll just put mine is that it is secure as long as you have a firewall on your server, as long as you put some security software on there, whatever. But it is generally down to the individual. Are you similarly minded?
Andrew, you hit the nail on the head. It comes down to the individual. It's a lot like flying in a sense. If you're an amazing pilot and say you were in the Air Force and you were a test pilot and you flew for decades, and then you want to fly your own personal Cessna around to take you from place to place, great. You're probably well qualified and you know exactly what to do and you're better than most pilots. If you're short of that kind of a standard, maybe you should take United Airlines or American or whatever company you want to take, but take a mainstream carrier. And so I would say it depends on the individual. And if you're going to run a site like a WordPress site on your own, I mean, I've dabbled in it a bit. It's a beast. And now, I absolutely would want to leave that to professionals. So I'd say, yeah, if you're a professional, absolutely, you can run those things securely, or as securely as possible within a certain level of risk. And if you're not, you should probably consider leaving it up to them. In terms of the overall security of something like WordPress versus, say, proprietary, the whole proprietary versus open source software debate, that comes down to the question of it's two different things. With open source, one advantage is you've got far more eyes on the problem. You've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are capable of getting into the code and really looking at it. And they also have a community that's motivated by more than just profit. They really love the software, Red Hat and things like that, or Linux, I should say. So you've got more eyes on the problem that can spot bugs. And in general, the open source software organizations or companies can get those patches out a lot faster to the community. If you've got a private sector, or I should say a proprietary company doing it, depends on the company. If it's a small to medium-sized company, they're not particularly good. They care more about their profits than anything else. Maybe they'll sit on a patch longer than an open source.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, Mark, because hasn't there over the past 18 months, there's been some major stories about companies that have known that they've got some major security problems and they've just sat on it. Is that correct?
Absolutely. As well as companies that should have known better, that should have had better security implementation, like SolarWinds. I mean, that's just a classic.
Yeah, that's the one that comes to mind, Mark. Can you give a quick outline of what that was?
Sure. So SolarWinds, it appears that it was compromised by a foreign threat actor, likely a foreign government threat actor. And I'll admit that's a high level threat. But part of the issue was in terms of, it seems that their review of their software was not as thorough, and their internal process for checking the security of their software was not where it should have been. And then, of course, when all the revelations came out, I believe they tried to blame it on a low-level staffer, maybe even an intern for having a bad password, and that's just not acceptable. So yeah, absolutely. They're playing.
What was their software? What did it? Because that was the problem. It was utilized in the stack of a lot of IT.
Mm-hmm. A lot of IT companies and the U.S. federal government too. So that was a big problem, possibly a problem for national security when you get to that level. So right, it affected a great deal of people and organizations. The corollary to that is you take a look at a company like Apple. Nobody can see the proprietary software that Apple runs in terms of its security. It's really hard to judge as an outsider, but Apple has a tremendous reputation. You can look at the people they hire, and you can look at their track record and their commitment to security. So yeah, I would say that you can be safe using proprietary, you can be safe using open source, but you have to take different types of precautions.
Right. So I think in general, what you're saying is you've got to really take it on a case-to-case basis. You can't just draw a broad open source is not secure. Priority software it's much more diverse than that.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
I got a follow few questions. I'm going to drop question 3 because I think it would be duplicating question 2, but it's a follow through question. Would you agree that these gangs, these criminal organizations, do you think that a lot of them are kind of quasi-government supported, i.e. they're based in Russia, China, North Korea, other countries?
America.
And do you think that they're freelancers, but they're also in some way supported by these governments in a kind of bounty, or when they crack, they are supported and also have the protection of these governments because they are also useful to some degree? Am I on the right track, Mark?
Spot on, Jonathan. Spot on. And there are multiple different arrangements that these types of gangs have. So in certain countries, these gangs are just allowed to operate freely as long as they don't go after members of that country, that type of thing, or neighboring countries that they're allied with. And then sometimes they have to pay a percentage of their profits to the government, like protection money, kind of like a protection racket. Other times they are forced to work for the government because the government has caught these guys hacking illegally, and they say, look, you used to do it for yourself, now you're going to do it for us. And they're not formally part of the government, but they're absolutely doing things on behalf of their government, whether they want to or not. All this has been proven out time and time again in open source reporting. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So we here in the U.S. are kind of at a disadvantage in terms of going against a setup like that, defending against something like that, because we're used to either having a binary threat of something like, is it a government threat or a criminal threat? Yes or no, that type of thing. But now you're looking at something that's in between, and they've got the protection, the legal protection of living in another country and doing their attacks from there.
Yeah, the reason I asked you this question because we're going to go for our break soon, is that I think there's this perception that it's still some teenage hacker in a basement, and some of it is. There was a notorious case in the UK. He hacked into a number of US state, and he'd got Asperger's syndrome, and there was a drawn out case. And there's been a couple others, but in general, this idea that it's a teenager or some skilled hacker, the reality is it's large teams, quasi under the support of governments. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of different groups and gangs out there that do this type of work, almost to the point of being fairly corporate about them. Emails that have been captured by I guess, I don't know, counter hackers, white hat hackers. They've seen how these guys talk about salaries and money and getting vacation time, things like that. So no, these are very well organized gangs. Reminds me of my time in Bogota, Colombia, decades ago now, and you had gangs kidnapping people down there for profit, and a lot of that was a very corporate type of thing.
And am I correct? Also, like I think it's been documented to some degree that in North Korea, they literally, their armed forces and department, they actually sell services. They sell groups of their hackers that are actually in the North Korean army, and they sell it on the open market as a resource. Have I said me right about that?
Interesting. I've got to admit, I had not heard about that, about the North Koreans selling their services out on the black market, but it seems plausible. And they certainly do have hacker units, and the FBI, has indictments out for a number of them, and they even apparently know some of them by name. So pretty fascinating work. Pretty fascinating.
Right.
Well, if you want conspiracy theories, Jonathan's your right here.
Most of it's right. That's the amazing thing. It just gets more and more interesting.
Sure.
So we're going to go for our break. We'll be back in a few moments with this fascinating discussion. We'll be back soon, folks. We're coming back. We've been delving in the world of hacking and in what we say in the UK, the spooks. That's a nickname for spies. In the world of spooks. Just want to point out that I do a great newsletter. It's really based on all the stories of the Friday Roundtable show. Also, I do a personal editorial. I try and choose a really interesting news story of the week. To get this, all you have to do is go over to WP-Tonic/newsletter, and you'll be able to sign up for that, and it'll be in your inbox around Sunday. So let's go on. Another thing that's been talked a lot, and it's covered by a particular catchphrase, and it's called surveillance capitalism. I would imagine you know this term. It's basically a whole industry has been built about surveilling people from every second that they're online. I can't pronounce her name. She's got a quite unpronounceable name for me.
Shoshana, shall I do it for you?
Yes, can you actually?
Shoshana Zuboff.
Zuboff.
Yeah. Shoshana Zuboff.
She popularised this in her book. Do you agree with some of her ideas and this concept of surveillance capitalism, Mark?
Absolutely. I agree with pretty much all of it. I read her book. It was fantastic. I was literally walking down the street, saw the book in the window of a bookstore, saw the title, and I said, yeah, I've got to read that. And it was fantastic because I'd been grappling with these ideas literally since decades ago. And back then, I remember talking to a friend of mine who said, hey, I don't mind Google having all of my data. I just don't want the government to have all of my data. I said, well, therein lies the rub. The issue is that companies like Google and others, I'm not going to pick on them, but all these companies in these spaces that collect data on us, they do it far more efficiently than the government ever could. And they do it legally because you're volunteering to give the data to these companies, right? And then if the government wanted that data, all it now needs to do is just go to Google or any other company, Facebook or Twitter, with a warrant and say, okay, now we'd like Jonathan's data. So,
well, I'm going to put to you, isn't the relationship, and Andrew's going to laugh at this, isn't the relationship even a bit more tighter than that? You know, we've discussed these foreign governments and their relationship with these foreign gangs, whatever you want to call them. But isn't the relationship with Amazon, Google, and the other tech even more closer with the government and the quasi-security services of Western governments to some degree? Aren't they quite useful, and their relationship is quite in bed with one another?
Sorry, Mark, I'm going to just add to this question.
Sure.
Are you talking about tax breaks? Maybe if, like, the government...
Well, then, you know, Google's obviously Google's a very monopolistic entity, much more than Microsoft was in the 90s, but there is no movement to threaten their monopoly and break them up. I only presume the reason is that they're protected to some extent because they're very useful to certain entities in the US government.
Jonathan, that's an interesting theory indeed, and let's unpack it. And here's how I'd go about doing that. You take a look at a few things. For example, not too long ago, a number of Google engineers said that they refused to work on a project because it went to the Department of Defense and they didn't want to be involved in militaristic things. If the government had some kind of a thumb on Google, they could have just suppressed all of that. It would have never come to light, and they'd be making whatever it is that they wanted for them. The other thing is the companies are quite independent in terms of what they're allowed to do under our laws. If there's some kind of a secret agreement with the government and those companies, I certainly don't know about it. But again, as far as I know, and as far as I've seen, if the government wants data from those companies, they have to go with a warrant through an actual legal process. There's got to be a certain bar for that process to start. It can't just be on a whim. And again, there are a number of examples where social media companies or tech companies have actually refused the government on things that were quite significant. Like, for example, when Apple refused to unlock the phone of two people who had committed terrorist shootings a number of years ago. They refused to do that. You would think that if the government had some kind of a backdoor or some kind of a secret alliance with them, out of any case, that would be kind of a no-brainer. Hey, give us the information on these phones so that we can maybe prevent another terrorist attack, that type of thing. But
whereas all they really needed to do to unlock those phones is go to the local mobile guy in the shopping mall, like the rest of us do.
Maybe. But in any event, so that's my concept on.
Yeah, sure, Mark. Yeah. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, this is going to be the last question because unfortunately I've got a meeting that I must attend at 5:30ish. I can be a minute or so late, and I know Jonathan's got it, and I know you're a busy guy as well. But I'm not going to go to question 6. But so there's been a lot of talk about TikTok, Chinese company grabbing data. It actually can, when you allow TikTok to be an app on your phone, it can scan the whole of your phone. There's been a lot of talk about that.
Right.
It's user permissions. So we've allowed them to do that. If you read the reams of terms and conditions that all these apps have, you will be aware of it, which you never do because it is literally reams of information, thousands of lines. Right. Do you think it's a security threat, TikTok?
I do. And people have said, well, how's this different from any other app that collects data? A couple of things. First of all, as you pointed out, Andrew, TikTok collects a lot more data than most apps. And then they also do the biometrics facial scanning, so it's got facial recognition. and it's asking for permission to use your microphone and your camera at any time, not just when you're doing your TikTok type of videos. So once you grant that permission, they can take all that stuff whenever they want it, and all of it goes to China, and China has a lower bar for accessing that data than the U.S.
It's one way of putting it, Mark.
Right. And so that, I think, is the concern. Honestly, I've downloaded apps before, particularly on non iPhones, on Android phones, and I downloaded a flashlight app, and it said, user permissions. Do you grant permission for the access to the microphone and the camera? I said, what does a flashlight need access to?
The light, for God's sake. Yeah.
So I quickly deleted the app, and so there you go. But once again, it's a social engineering problem because everyone's giving that permission, and the government can't just step in really easily and tell consumers, hey, you can't use that app. In the government, they could say, hey, if you're in the military, you can't use it. If you're in certain agencies, maybe you can't use it, that kind of thing. But to the rest of the public, they can't do it. And that goes back to Zuboff and the surveillance capitalism issue. All these tech companies have managed to navigate a path in between law, culture, and societal norms to extract troves of data that no one could ever have foreseen, and they do it all legally because it's extraordinarily hard to regulate in capitalist democratic societies.
Yeah, I'm gonna end the podcast part of the show. I do want to ask question 6, but Andrew needs to go.
Sure.
So I'm going to end the podcast part. So, Mark, what's the best way for people to find out more about you and what you're up to?
Come to our website, comarcyber.com, COMAR cyber.com, and reach out to us there. We're also on LinkedIn and Facebook, but comarcyber.com.
I have all the links in the show notes, folks. So, Andrew, what's the best way for people to find out more about what you're up to and your thoughts?
Bertha.ai and at Arnie Palmer on Twitter. And I'll communicate with anyone. I'm like that.
That's great. We're going to continue the discussion after the show. I'm going to ask, I've got a question about Edward Snowden. I'm sure Mark is going to be very entertaining on his thoughts about Mr. Snowden. You'll be able to see the whole interview plus the other couple of questions on the WP-Tonic YouTube channel. Go over there and watch the whole interview. And please subscribe to the channel. It really does help the podcast and WP-Tonic. And that's great. We'll see you soon next week. We've got another fabulous guest. We'll see you soon, folks. Bye.
See you guys.
Yeah, see you later, Andrew. So bonus content. So like I say, Mr. Snowden was a subcontractor for the NSA, published a lot of documents, now resident of the US, of Russia, lives on the outskirts of Moscow, seemingly. Can't come back to the US. So what's your view of Mr. Snowden? And is he a Soviet, is he a Russian puppet and a Russian resource, basically, or is he something more legitimate?
So first off, two things are really important to get straight at the very beginning of this. First is that he's not a whistleblower. A lot of people have called him that, and he simply isn't. In the U.S., there are standards for being a whistleblower. There are certain things that you have to do, and if you do them, you get protections from being prosecuted or biased against in your job. He skipped through all of that and went straight to releasing classified, highly classified, damaging information. So, first off, he's not a whistleblower. Second, he clearly violated his secrecy oath. It's an oath that everybody in the intelligence community has to take. I took it also. You're bound by the secrecy oath into death. I mean, you legally can't even write a memoir full of secret information that hasn't been cleared for release and leave it with someone and say, hey, after I die, publish this. You're not allowed to do that. Why? Because it's important to keep secrets, to defend our country as well as all the countries that we partner with and who rely on us. So I would put him in that category first off. Not a whistleblower, and he violated his secrecy oath. In terms of any kind of a philosophical point that he was making about freedom of speech, or a question of the government versus individual rights and the rights of citizens, again, I would have to ask some questions about what it was that he did and why he did it. First off, he released a lot of information just out into the public, well, mediated through journalists, he said. And I guess the question is, out of all the stuff that he released, how much of that had to do with even the points that he was making about speech or freedom or what have you, versus all the other stuff that was completely extraneous to that, but was still classified? Why would he release all that information? And then second, why would he, again, if he's talking about individual rights, freedoms, and freedom of speech and so on, why would he seek refuge in two of the countries that have offer the least protections, the fewest protections?
Well, his argument there is that things were made, the State Department and the CIA, surprise, surprise, put a lot of pressure on a lot of governments, especially in South America, that Ecuador and some other South American countries that initially offered him asylum, that they were persuaded that it wasn't to their best interest, and Russia was the only country that would offer him asylum. What's your view? I got certain views about that myself. What was your view about that?
Well, again, it seems odd that those are the countries that you end up in. Again, I can't speak to his thought process on figuring out his escape plan, but just the fact that he felt that he needed an escape plan kind of indicates that there was some kind of malicious intent there. If he really, really felt this strongly about these concepts, and clearly he knew he was going to lose his job because he planned to leave the country, why not make a case of this in public here in the U.S. and go to a court here in the U.S. and argue for the release of these things or something like that? There are so many other ways that he could have done it that would have indicated that he really cared about these principles more than what appears to be evident by seeing what he actually ended up doing.
Well, his argument is that he would end up in North Virginia in front of the North Virginia courts, which has a reputation of just being the proxy of the CIA, and he wouldn't get a fair trial. But that's his argument. I'm not saying it, but that he's publicly stated that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that he said that triggered him off and decided on his actions was when, I think is it Mr. Clapper, the former head of the NCA, was put in front of, I think it was either the Senate or the House of Representatives, and he denied in public that the NSA had a surveillance, and Mr. Snowden said that public statement, that denial of what the NSA was actually doing, triggered his actions. What's your thoughts about that?
Again, I can't really comment on what he was thinking about at the time that motivated him to do that, but really, I've got to say, nothing justifies doing what he did in the way that he did it, simply because there are so many other better ways to make these points. Even if he had just come out and done it, in a theoretical sense or something, or just asked the question, what does the government owe its citizens, and start a debate like that, that would be a very different type of thing and a different type of place for him. But in terms of what motivated him to do it, I can't speak to his personal motivation.
No, because you're not a mind reader, obviously.
Right.
Just to finish off, a broad question, but I'm interested in your thoughts about this. Obviously, every country needs its security services. No, we live in a dangerous world. We've got to be realistic. It'd be lovely that we could spend that money on universities and healthcare, but the reality is every country faces internal and external threats to its security. Obviously, America does. Britain has extensive security apparatus, and so does many Western countries. There are concerns, though, because of 9/11 and the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security and the increasing size of MI6 and MI5's budget. What does it really mean that their budget will expand infinitely, or does there are there necessary clear boundaries? Because also, obviously, to have the maximum security, it's very useful to have the maximum surveillance and access to everybody. If you want to reduce the maximum risk, that's very useful, but it's also counter to democracy, freedom, or the thing that you're trying to protect. So it's a difficult balance. Do you think these discussions are held often in these type of organisations internally? Is this a constant discussion in themselves, or is it not really touched?
About the budget and the size of the
the duality of the situation, by the actions of the security services, you could destroy the thing that you're actually trying to protect.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sure. No, actually, right. No, that's a great point. And absolutely, when I know that when I was in government, we always talked about the law, and everybody was well trained in knowing the legal boundaries of what we were allowed to do and what we were not allowed to do. And again, you can see evidence of that by virtue of the fact that there have been problems in the past, and people have paid a price for that. But absolutely, we always consider the laws, and we absolutely understand that there is a balance. I don't know of a single person that I've ever worked with who would like to have some kind of a total all-knowing police state where we could just go anywhere, do anything, and know anything about.
Well, I think that's called China, isn't it?
maybe, but certainly not America. So my point is that nobody wants that kind of a situation. Again, for the vast majority of the intelligence community, it's outward focused. It's not focused on the U.S. I mean, the FBI, they've got different regulations because they are supposed to be finding threats here domestically in the U.S. Different thing. But in terms of your question about the boundaries, absolutely, that topic is engaged by people in the IC, as well as people in Congress, as well as people on the outside. I mean, everybody reads things that are published. Everyone considers all those things too. I think this is really important because, again, nobody wants to end up in a police state, and I think that the boundaries are quite clear.
You got time for one more question, or do you
Sure.
need to be on?
No.
So the other thing that really surprised me was this whole discussion that Russia was influencing elections. I found it extremely naive, Mark, because that's what foreign security services do. That's what the Israeli service does. That's what the British external security service does. That's what to some extent, what the CIA does. Its purpose is to know what is going on in other countries, to influence those countries to the betterment of America. That is what MI5, MI6 is about. To some extent, also other purposes as well. I found the whole thing, Rob, what that's, the Russian security service has a history. They specialize in that type of manipulation. They brag about it. So why was everybody very surprised about it?
That's a good question. I think that we're going to be unpacking that one for years to come. I literally just had a conversation with a few professors of mine from my master's program, and we were talking about how this period will be looked at by future political scientists, given some more distance in time from the situation now, but 10, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. How will people view all that? And sure, again, out in the public media, the government's made declarations about this, about the Russians' interference in the U.S. elections. I think that's been, as you pointed out, it's been going on for a while now, and people. I think the difference now is that there are so many more people on social media, and there are so many more avenues for social media. Maybe in the 1950s or 60s, if we had social media, we would have these kinds of debates, and people would take very different sides, or would have taken very different sides back then if we had that. But we didn't have that. You would just argue with the person, at the bar or in your family or your friends, that type of thing. But now you can literally argue with hundreds of millions of people at once. So it allows every single person to have their own opinion out there on display and for discussion. We've never had a situation like that before, and I think that is the accelerant for everything that happened with the Russian interference.
Yeah, it's a bit similar to the criticism of America's influence in Ukraine. Of course, America and the security services were trying to influence what was going. That's what soft power is about, isn't it? Influencing other countries to see the light of your policies, and that's what governments do, isn't it?
Regarding Ukraine, I can't speak to that just because I don't know what the government was doing in terms of Ukraine, prior to the war there, or right now. I'm outside of the government now, so I'm not privy to that stuff. But in terms of soft power, sure, I think that governments exercise soft power in a lot of different ways. And as you pointed out, every government influences other governments and other countries in some way or another, primarily using soft power. So, right.
Because when I was living in London, I knew a lot of Russians. Mm-hmm. This is a generality, like all generalities. I found they were all... I always were a little bit kept them a distance. They were all in business. They always had connections with their motherland. They moved to London. They always seemed well financed and well connected. But I always observed with them that there was a mixture of slapstick with high sophistication. It was a strange concoction. Mm-hmm. In general, they could be rather blunt as a brick, but also you should never underestimate the Russians because their history, culture, they have the ability to surprise those that underestimate them. Would you think I'm on the right track?
No, that's a great point. I think that Russian culture, it's fascinating. It's got a tremendously long history, and it's very complex. It's multi-layered. I think very few people, certainly in the West, understand Russian culture, and it's worth studying. I studied it a bit when I was in undergrad, not nearly enough, but enough to know that, as you pointed out, it's complex. They have motivations going back for centuries.
Well, it's violent and bloody, isn't it? But I suppose you could say that about American history. But when you study Russian, all I can say it's even more bloody. So I think we better wrap it up. You've been very generous with your time, Mark. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. We will be back next week with another discussion tribe. We'll see you soon. Bye.